Welcome to the Latin America Regional Advisory Committee's webinar series, A Path to a Career in Geophysics. The SEG Latin America Regional Advisory Committee and myself, Lori Weitzel, will serve as your host for today's webinar. Before we begin, the model for this webinar will be a short presentation followed by an extended question and answer session. During the question and answer session, if you'd like to ask your questions, please raise your hand in the webinar interface, and I can adjust your settings to allow you to ask your questions directly to the presenter. Additionally, if you'd like, you could just enter your questions into the question and answer box. Today's presenter is Sven Treitel. He is a German-born Argentinian-American geophysicist who, with Anders Robinson, was instrumental in the transition of exploration geophysics from analog to digital recording and data processing. Early in the technological timetable of their profession, geophysicists laboriously tracked peaks and valleys on photographic paper, data processing vis-a-vis interpretation. Today, such operations minus digital computers would appear self-contradictory. A turning point occurred in the mid-1960s when geophysical companies began the gradual conversion from analog to digital systems, thus becoming, in fact, the first industry to successfully make widespread use of digital technology in its infancy and now one of the most computer-intensive of all industries. Sven received a bachelor's, master's, and PhD from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And also he is a member of AAPG, AGU, AMGE, EAGE, GCSSEPM, GSA, and GSH. Without further ado, let us please welcome Sven Treitel. Take it away, Sven.
Thank you very much for that gracious introduction. So hopefully everybody can see my screen, and it's pretty obvious that who is talking to you, so I don't need to spend an hour on that subject. What I do want to address during my remarks is, first of all, why should anybody continue studying geophysics? And that leads, of course, to job prospects for geophysicists. And job prospects improve if one has ahead of time strategies for success. I will end up by talking of 5 currently active topics in exploration geophysics, in most of which, but not all, I have worked myself over my rather long career. So here's me. Since you can't see me, at least you can see a photograph. Well, this is who I am. As Laurie mentioned, I have traveled all over the globe in the past. I started out in Germany, through Spain, Italy, the United Kingdom, Argentina, and finally ended up in the USA. I went to Spain to grade school, then continued my studies in the UK and ended up in Argentina. So you can read the rest of this lengthy career as well as I can. And I finally end up in Tulsa, Oklahoma as a consulting geophysicist, a capacity in which I still operate today. Well, first of all, the question that I would like to discuss briefly is, why should one study geophysics? Well, it has very interesting prospects. One can either go into teaching or research or industry. In my case, I chose industry because at the time I finished graduate school, jobs in academia were scarce. But all 3 of these continue to be good possibilities. Now, our branch of geophysics is solid earth geophysics, and that, as everybody I'm sure knows, consists of various subdisciplines. I've highlighted in red seismology, but there are many other disciplines, gravity, magnetics, electromagnetics, and so on. My career has been mainly in seismology and gravity, but there are many other fields that you can choose. In my opinion, there are many excellent universities around the globe to follow these studies, and I've listed just a few of them here. The complete list would be too long to put on my presentation, but here you can see a few that you might want to consider. You can divide job prospects for geophysicists, excuse me, into two major categories. You can work at universities and for the governments, not only the US government, but any government of any major country around the globe. The prospects at universities and in government jobs clearly are best for PhDs, somewhat less so for people with only master's degrees. And they generally guarantee stable employment. In other words, the prospects for remaining in the same position with the one that you start with are better at universities and in the government than they are in industry, which gets me to exploration geophysics. If you want to contemplate a career in research, the prospects, in my estimation, and others may disagree with me, are best if you work for an oil company. They are what I could say they're fair to good. They're not excellent because, as everybody knows, the oil industry has had its problems during the past few years. I won't go into any detail because these are well known. But as of today, the employment security, I think, is better in the oil companies than it is for the service companies. However, you have a paradox in that most of the significant research nowadays, in my opinion, is done by the service companies. Yet the service companies, since they depend on the oil companies for business, have a poorer employment record than the oil companies. So there are some oil companies that continue to do research, but the center of gravity for R&D today is with the service companies. So you have a Hobson's choice. You either go and work for a service company with less positive job prospects, or you work for oil companies that have fewer positions in R&D, but you have better job continuation. So all this depends, of course, obviously on the price of oil. So you should always be prepared to lose your job and find another one. That was not true when I was beginning my career, but unfortunately it's true today. One might as well be realistic. Well, what can an individual do to have a successful career in this field? First of all, I would say join and be active in professional societies. Try to attend technical conferences. Keep yourself technically up to date by reading your professional journals. That, of course, means geophysics. And always network with your colleagues. But more importantly, if you want to um, be successful, you want to publish your work. And the famous saying is publish or perish. So nobody, of course, wants to perish. So in order to avoid perishing, consider publishing. The best job security, as I say here, is become outside your own organization. If somebody in an organization tells you that what the work that you've done is proprietary and you can get all the glory that you can possibly want by being known inside your company, don't believe it. That is because no company can guarantee you job security. So the best way to keep employed is to make yourself known outside the organization for which you work at a given point in time. Now let me go to a technical part of my presentation. As Laurie mentioned, I started out my career by participating in the conversion of the industry from analog days to digital days. This is an old picture of the ENIAC computer, which in itself is less interesting than the fact that in front of the computer, you see two ladies. And unfortunately, when all this began, the ladies were relegated to decorating photographs such as these, but their positions were mainly secretarial or as assistants. Luckily, nowadays that has completely changed, but that's the way it used to be. I'd like to comment about 5 technical areas that I've had some exposure to during my career, and they're listed here. And so that's where I will be spending some time next. First of all, hydraulic fracking. Everybody knows, presumably, what hydraulic fracking is. So I will not describe the procedure as such, but it does involve, as you can see here, the injection of a fracturing fluid into the subsurface and hopefully causing fractures in the formation from which one wants to produce oil or gas. This is a schematic. And the challenge, of course, is to know where these cracks that are being produced by the fracking procedure, where they are located, and if in fact they exist. And there are various geophysical techniques to locate these fractures. And if you want to read about this in more detail, there is an excellent paper published in one of the science journals. These are journals by the American Association of Advancement for Science. And this problem is of particular interest nowadays in the state of Oklahoma, where I live, where in the past few years, the fracking procedure has been associated with a spectacular increase in seismicity, as you can see from this picture. In the 3-year period from December 2009 to December 2012, the number of earthquakes caused by fracking has increased spectacularly. It is now decreasing, once the problem has been recognized by controlling the reinjection of water produced by fracking into the ground. That is not the fracking itself that has produced the seismicity, but in fact, the fractures produced by the injection of water produce wastewater, and that again is extracted from the formation and re-injected at greater depth into the rock, and that causes the increase in seismicity. But that problem is now under control. But the entire subject of fracking and its seismic signatures is a very active and ongoing area of research. Next one is currently extremely active, and it goes under the name of full waveform inversion. And the idea is to calculate model responses of inferred structures that exist somewhere in your area in which you're prospecting, and you want to use these models to understand what the seismic recording is telling you. In other words, you are given real seismic data, and you have to have an idea of a model so that could possibly describe your surface observations. So if you have no idea at all, then full waveform inversion simply does not work. But if you have an idea, then there are techniques whose details, of course, I can't go into in this short time period, to fit modeled data to observed data. And before one can even do that, you play games with purely synthetic data, as shown in this slide. So if you say that the real Earth looked like this on the left, you would start with an initial model like this one, on just simply a layered model here on the right, and you would calculate the seismic signature of this model and then feed to it the recorded data. And then there are computer algorithms that are very much in the limelight today, which allow you to iteratively converge, if all goes well, to a structure that looks like this from an initial structure that looks like this. And so here are the stages in such a calculation. So you end up finally you start with the real data, and you end up with a close fit, if all goes well, that looks like this. Now, of course, I haven't told you how this is accomplished, but if you're interested, you need to go to the references in journals like Geophysics or Geophysical Prospecting, where these are described in many papers. Next subject is one dear to my heart because I had something to do with the initial development of it. That's the subject of seismic deconvolution. And this goes back a long way, it goes back to the 60s, as Laurie mentioned. And again, I will illustrate the picture, illustrate the method rather, by a synthetic model. Suppose you had a subsalt model, subsalt structure rather, that looks like this. And this is after some work that was done by Western Geco in the early 2000s. And as you can see, if you have any experience with real data, this is not real data, this is just a model. There, with that kind of layering, this is an open invitation for the Earth to produce multiple reflections. Well, multiple reflections, before they were properly understood, can cause huge problems in making any sense of the seismic data. So the question that was attacked and is still being attacked, this is still an ongoing subject of investigation, is how does one get rid of multiples? And one of the earliest successful techniques to accomplish this goal is the deconvolution process. So for such a model such as this, this is synthetic data now, this is not real data. But if, in fact, you had a model that looks like this, or real Earth that looks like this is the recording you get. And such a recording would cause, in the past, enormous headaches to the seismic interpreter. So we did come up in the 60s with the very computer-intensive methods that allowed us to eliminate these spurious reflections from the data, and this is what was accomplished. So I'll flip back and forth. From here was the raw data, and this is the deconvolved data. You can see that the results, while by no means perfect, there's certainly a vast improvement over this. This was a major breakthrough. Finally, the subject of migration or seismic imaging. Again, the efforts go back to geometrical optics, which of course has been worked on since the 17th century. But the first successful use of seismic imaging or seismic migration was actually accomplished, strangely enough, by a Dutch geophysicist by the name of Hagedorn. I say strangely enough because many of you may recall that the pioneers of geometrical optics again came from the Netherlands. And so it was quite fitting and perhaps not a coincidence that the first person who managed to accomplish the feat of seismic imaging was Mr. Hagedorn, who was a citizen of the Netherlands. This, of course, is work done much later by Sam Gray, who used to be with CGG. And the idea, again, is to take unprocessed data like this and use principles that are not really that far removed from geometrical optics and its various improvements to start out with a picture like this to produce pictures like these. And again, the difference between a picture like this and a picture like this is huge. And it gives you an idea of what the developers of seismic migration have accomplished, have been able to accomplish over the years. If Hagedorn saw this today, he would not believe his eyes. So this is one field in which there is ongoing work, but I thought that a brief exposure to what can be accomplished would be of interest to you. finally, the subject very much in the limelight today, one in which I am active myself, is the application of machine learning techniques to exploration geophysics. In particular, the picture you see here is the application of these techniques to the picking of faults on seismic images. Again, I certainly do not have the time to describe to you what machine learning in fact is, except to comment briefly that we have come up with methods. By we, I don't mean necessarily myself, but primarily people in the electrical engineering and statistics professions have come up with methods that allow one to train networks, so-called artificial neural nets, to take a series of observations and be taught how to interpret these observations based on a learning procedure. This is a fascinating subject. My brief description of it doesn't do it justice, but again, there are a wealth of articles that you can find in the literature, including the geophysical literature, that deal with this emerging topic, and I have to refer you to these. But the idea is to start out with a seismic image and eventually to end up, say, with a faulting solution, such as the one that you see here, that corresponds to this picture. Now, the solution will never be unique, so we can never get around the so-called uniqueness curse, but this will be a possible solution. Excuse me. We're back to the correct one. And well, this is again a schematic, and not a very good one, to apply the process of machine learning to seismic data. So this is the way you do this. You take a large number of models, such as the ones pictured here, and by forward modeling, you calculate the synthetic seismograms that look like this. And so you can then use the machine learning procedures to make your computer code literally to learn how to recognize structures that have these signatures that look like this. And so then you hope that the real seismic data that you have been given by the field crews, which is this here, will then be able to profit from the trained computer code obtained from this step here, and CNN stands for a convolutional network. There are many kinds of artificial neural networks, and convolutional one happens to be of particular use for our geophysical purposes. And again, I don't have time to go into detail, but if the procedure works, then you have produced a picture of the subsurface that you have been after. Now that, if it works well, but sometimes it doesn't work. So nobody should fear that the seismic interpreter in the next couple of decades is going to be replaced by computers. That simply is not going to happen. But what will happen is that these tools, as they evolve, will make the task of the seismic interpreter a simpler one than is the case today. So with that, I will stop and ask for questions.
All right, let's see. If you have questions, all right, go ahead, Gustavo.
Good morning, Sven. This is Gustavo Carstens.
Yes?
So nice to hear you like usual. It's always a pleasure. I have probably 100 questions to you. And, yeah, I believe that we don't have enough time for that. But basically, I would like to ask you about how rewarding geophysics has been for you in all this time that you have been working in this subject, because I believe that there have been bad times, good times, sometimes that when you didn't care too much, but how rewarding it has been for you.
Well, speaking for myself, it's been extremely rewarding. Certainly, I would not have stayed with it. I chose exploration geophysics, as I mentioned, because when I graduated from the university, there were no academic jobs. Or I shouldn't say there were none, but there were very few. And there were many in the oil industry. I was lucky by birth to have arrived in the industry when it was emerging from the analog world into the digital world. But now the industry does face some problems, not the least of which is the issue of climate change, which the industry at first did not recognize, but to its credit, it is recognizing it today. So what does this mean for the profession that all of us have been active in, like you and I? Of course, I cannot predict the future, but on the one hand, it's true that we have to come to grips with the climate change problem. On the other hand, it is also true that we cannot instantaneously stop producing oil and gas, because that would cause a catastrophe, a global catastrophe, which, to my knowledge, nobody is yet addressing, but it needs to be addressed. What is the way? How do we solve both these problems? And I don't know the answer, but I don't hear many people discussing it.
Okay.
So maybe you'd like to think about some solutions.
All right, we have we have several questions.
Yes.
One question that was entered into our question and answer box is from Sergio Chavez Perez.
Yes.
And he says, "Hi, this is Sergio. I have had you have had a rather privileged career, and lots of people do consider you as a role model. What has been your most enjoyable experience during your career, and why? When has what has been the most difficult, and also why?"
Well, the most enjoyable experience, well, there have been many, but one that is particularly interesting is when I looked at the first successful deconvolution experiments in the early 70s that I and my colleagues at Amoco conducted. And we were actually able, we were successful to show that the method of predictive deconvolution worked on synthetic data, but then we tried it on real data. And much to our surprise, we had beginner's luck in that the first example that we tested was a great success. I could almost say it was a spectacular success. We were there very lucky because subsequent experiments were not so successful. And so we had to go back to the drawing boards and refine our methods. But it really gave one a good feeling to see that what came out of the digital computer was an enormous improvement in the quality of the data compared to what had gone into the machine. And I still remember that we celebrated. There were a couple of us, of course, involved with this success. And that ultimately led to our early publications on the subject.
Okay, and I guess the second part of that question was, what was the most maybe frustrating thing that you've ever run into during your career?
Well, the most frustrating part was, or still is for that matter, when things started going downhill in the oil industry in the 80s, when I saw some of my colleagues losing their jobs. And then I began thinking of how we as professionals could survive these ups and downs in the industry. And that led me to conclude that the only way you could protect yourself against these now inevitable ups and downs in a commodity industry is to, as professional geophysicists, to make ourselves known by our colleagues. And that means publishing and attending meetings, technical meetings, as many as possible, and writing. You can write articles about your work, even if you do not do original research. There are plenty of people who publish about their interpretational work. In fact, one of the two journals of the SEG is called Interpretation. So all the interpreters have a chance to publish their ideas and their suggestions in interpretation, not in geophysics. And so that's my recommendation. I will still feel very strongly that one has to become known outside to survive inside.
Okay, and I thought we had a hand up in the attendee group. Oh, all right, we're going to take a live question, and then we'll move to some of the other questions. So, all right, Ruben, you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is Ruben Martinez. Sven, how are you?
Fine, I'm fine, thank you.
Actually, the question that Sergio had is the one that I had, but I would like to ask you, what will be, I mean, the geophysical industry has been characterized by incremental innovations all the time. But there gotta be some disruptive innovation somewhere along the years, you know. You have been in the industry for many years. So the question is, have you ever seen any disruptive innovation? Perhaps you will answer deconvolution, but any other part of the technology development that you have seen as a disruptive innovation, something that has changed completely the game in this industry?
Well, the most disruptive development in the geophysical industry, in my opinion, has been the discovery in the late 50s and early 60s that digital computers had something to contribute to our field. And if that one disruptive, I don't know what else would be.
Yeah.
When I was a student, we had a group at MIT called the Geophysical Analysis Group. And I was a grad student who worked in this group. And we were sponsored by a series of oil and service companies at the time. And one representative of one of the companies came up to me and said, well, all this time series work that you guys are doing is very interesting, but you can't really do any filtering on the computer. You can only do that with lumped networks.
Uh-huh.
And clearly he didn't understand. He was an electrical engineer, a PhD in electrical engineering, and actually a very creative individual. But he could not understand, he had never heard of convolution. So not having heard of convolution, he, of course, could not understand the term deconvolution.
Mm-hmm.
And so he could not follow, he could not understand how one could use the digital computer to filter seismic recordings. Now, of course, nobody today would ask such a question because everybody knows that you can process or filter seismic data with computers.
Yes.
So this question does not arise today, but it arose when I was a student, and to me, in my professional life, that was the most spectacular change that I experienced, or that the entire industry experienced. Because
Yes.
before 1960, the oil companies, if they had any computers, they used them primarily for accounting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Welcome.
All right, thanks. We have some more questions, and I'm going to go to the question from a group of young geophysical SEG members from the University of Kansas. And they want to know, as a native Tulsan, why did you decide, they would like to know or to ask, what geophysical reason for your decision to stay in Tulsa when others go elsewhere?
Well, we stayed in Tulsa because our friends live here, and I saw no reason to leave, particularly since it is now possible to work remotely, which I've continued to do. And just as we have here myself lecturing to the audience here remotely, means that something that could not be done when I started out in this game, you can do nowadays. So I saw no reason to pick up and go someplace else.
Okay, great. Thank you. I guess there's a fundamental question that no one has asked yet. And that question is, what inspired you to get into geophysics to begin with?
Well, it's a very good question. I came to MIT with the intent to study naval engineering because I was interested in ships. But at the time, you were asked to take a set of courses over which you had no control. You had no electives. So one of the courses I was forced to take was called Descriptive Geometry. And sadly enough, this is a course that I failed. And so I went to see my advisor, and he looked at my grade and said, well, if you continue this way, you're going to flunk out of school, which, of course, he didn't need to tell me because I knew that was obvious, that something had to change. And so I looked around for something else to go into, and I was always interested in geology. And I discovered that one of the departments dealt with geology. That it was not even called geophysics. It was only called geology department. So I decided to switch fields and decided that engineering did not hold a good future for me. And I switched to geology and discovered that actually there was another branch of geology called geophysics. So being interested in mathematics as well as naval engineering, I said, this is an excellent, I concluded that this is an excellent combination of fields, and I never regretted going into it since, which is now more than 50 years ago. So I ended up in geophysics by accident. It's not, it would be nice to say that I was interested to become a geophysicist at age 6. It would make a nice story, but it would not be true. I just stumbled into it, as you stumble into many things throughout one's lifetime.
All right. Thank you very much for that. We have another question, and it says, given the changes that you've observed over 6 decades, what do you think geophysicists will be able to do routinely in the future with machine learning and AI-based techniques?
Could you repeat that, please?
Sure, it's a pretty long question. Given the changes that you've seen over your career, what do you think geophysicists will be able to do routinely in the future with machine learning and AI-based techniques?
Well, the major contribution that I see coming from machine learning is it will make the task of the geophysical interpreter different than it is today. It will remove much of the routine work from the process, enabling the interpreter to concentrate more exclusively on the geology and wrestle less with the geophysical technology. So the interpreters, the interpreter's job will change, but it will not go away, because there is a lot of hype that one reads about machine learning, that it will completely replace physicians and geophysicists. For example, I have seen articles telling us that computers will be conducting or carrying out medical diagnosis. In my opinion, it's sheer nonsense. I certainly would hate to be diagnosed by a computer. And it is equally unlikely that the seismic interpretations will be done exclusively by machines that have learned to act as surrogate seismologists. What these machine learning techniques will do is to make the seismic interpreter's job simpler so that he or she can concentrate on purely on the geology and the engineering aspects of these problems, which is not the case today.
Okay, we have another question that asks, well, it states, you've worked in many different places around the world. What was your favorite work location and why? And also, what was your least favorite?
Well, I can't think of a least favorable location, but the favorable location that I had is right here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when I worked at the Chemical Research Center. I was lucky by birth that I was around when the oil industry operated at its peak, in the sense that all the oil companies in the 60s and 70s operated well-staffed, well-equipped, well-funded research laboratories. And I was lucky enough to be able to have a part in recruiting people to work in our lab who were extremely talented and had been well trained in the various disciplines. And that enabled me to either originate some research projects which led to significant successes. It also led me to had some research programs that failed, but there can be no success without failure in this game. And that was a source of great satisfaction to me. The things have changed since then. In fact, as I mentioned at the outset of my remarks, if you're a young person today going into this field and want to do research, as I mentioned, you are probably better off to work for a service company where most of the action is. But the job prospects at service companies are erratic. In my day, when I started out, you essentially had a job for a lifetime. That, of course, is no longer true today. And those times will probably not come back. But your job prospects are still better in the oil industry than they are in the service industry. Or job continuity, I should say, rather than job prospects. Job continuities are better in the oil industry.
Okay, great. Also, what work did you conduct in Italy, and where were you located in Italy?
Good question. I was in Italy when I was 7 years old. So at that time, the only thing I conducted is staring out of the window. In other words, I was not an adult and was not, at that time, at age 7, I didn't know what geophysics was. There are child prodigies, but I was not one of them.
Okay, thank you. We have more questions. The one question is related to students and emerging professionals, and what, in addition to being current and known beyond your current employer, what other skills do you think would be beneficial to students and emerging professionals with the industry the way it is today?
That is an excellent question, and one that I have given much thought to. My answer is train when you get your training, pick a field within geophysics that allows you to practice the skills that you use in exploration geophysics in other disciplines. And I'm thinking of, in particular, of one of my students that I had in Germany during a sabbatical year I spent there in the 90s, who took his geophysical skills and applied them to medical imaging. And it may come as no surprise to many of you that there have been sessions during recent SEG meetings in which medical imaging methods are compared to geophysical imaging methods. And it turns out that both disciplines can learn a lot from each other. This former student of mine has had a very successful career for a firm in Germany that develops medical imaging technology. So if you are interested to do, if you're employed in a oil company and are doing migration work, then you are placed very strategically to use these skills in any other field that requires imaging technology. And the applications of techniques that you learn by doing seismic migration or seismic imaging go over into many disciplines, such as medical imaging, remote imaging, remote sensing, detection, say, of cracks in aircraft. That has been very much in the press. There have been accidents in the airlines caused by cracks in the fuselage of the airplanes. These cracks are detected with acoustic techniques. So the techniques that we learn in geophysics are applicable to many disciplines. So when you are a student, no matter what you major into, you should always think about where else can I apply the skills that I'm acquiring. It is very dangerous to concentrate your skills in a very narrow way, so that if something does happen to your job prospects, at least you're equipped to make a change. When I was a student, none of my professors told me, lectured to me in that sense. But I think the world has changed, and it's necessary to make sure that your knowledge, your professional knowledge spectrum is as broad as it possibly can be.
Great, thank you. We have a comment, and it says, Sven, please write your professional memoirs and publish them. I'm sure the SEG would be happy to publish them, and many generations of geophysicists will benefit from them. So
very, very nice.
My idea for something for you to do when you eventually retire.
That's right. Well, that will be some time from now, hopefully.
I think so. All right, we have time for one or two more questions, if anybody has them. All right. I think we answered all of the questions, and I think we're doing pretty
All
good.
the questions. Well,
We have another question. So it says you have dealt with plenty of talented people. based on that, any comments about the latest generations? Are they ready to take over geophysical activities, or are they missing something?
Well, that's an interesting question also. My impression is that the young people coming into the industry today are far better trained than my generation was. We struggled with such things as how to write computer code. When I started out writing code, there were no languages except machine languages like C or C++. There weren't even, not even C and C++ were around, more primitive versions of C and C++. Anybody who has used or has coded in C knows that that is a much more challenging issue than coding in Python today. So there have been enormous improvements in techniques that were not available when I started in this game. So I have every confidence in the modern generation to cope with the problems, which of course are far more complicated than the ones that my generation had to face when we started out. So the young generation is equipped to handle more complicated problems. It's a good thing that mine was not facing similar problems.
All right. One last question, if anybody has one, and then we're going to have to wrap things up. All right. Well, I guess I have one question before we end. And it has to do with machine learning and AI and coding and how these all work. They all seem very positive. Everybody has a lot of trust in these ways to analyze data. But the question would be, how best to guard against some of the overhype of the use of these tools in geophysics?
Well, your question can be generalized to all applications of machine learning, to other disciplines. There is an enormous amount of hype floating around, and that's inevitable. Whenever a new technique comes into the picture, there is hype. Exaggerated claims are made, and one has to be very careful. I'll give you one example in exploration geophysics. In the 70s, there was a huge fuss about techniques that then turned out to be completely fake. And I'm not saying that the machine learning technology today is fake. It stands on a good mathematical basis, but the amount of nonsensical claims made about it are visible every day in the press. For example, the term artificial intelligence, I personally question, because we don't, how can we talk about artificial intelligence if we don't even understand what real intelligence is? Nobody knows what real intelligence is. I mean, an insect has more neurons than the largest supercomputer can produce artificial neural neurons. So this is something that happens whenever there is a new technology or a new product or a new anything. It's hyped and it's unavoidable. Going back to geophysical terms, you have signal and you have noise. And your question is, you always have to eliminate the noise so that you can see the signal. So the hype I consider to be noise, which has to be eliminated by everybody in his own brain, his or her own brain. Perhaps that's a good way to end this discussion.
Yep, I think we are done with questions for the day, but I'm sure there are lots that are still out there.
Well, people have my email address, so I'll be glad to answer emails.
All right. All right. Well, with that, I'd like to thank you, Sven, and thank all of you for attending the SEG Latin America Regional Advisory Committee's webinar as part of our webinar series, A Path to a Career in Geophysics. Please look to our social media posts to register for next month's interesting talk. Thank you again for attending today, and thank you, Sven, for a very interesting presentation. We appreciate it. Until next time, everybody have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.